think we'll get started.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, thanks everyone for coming. I think we've reached that point in the semester where everybody's commitments have exceeded their lofty goals for themselves. But we are delighted that
Presenters included.
Presenters included, yeah. So, my name is Gautam Nair, for those of you who don't know me. I'm an assistant professor of public policy here at the Kennedy School. I want to start off with a few announcements before the discussion begins. The Ash Center acknowledges the land on which Harvard University sits is the traditional territory of the Massachusetts people. We also recognize the continuing presence of the neighboring Wampanoag and Nipmuc nations. So today's discussion is being recorded and will be made publicly available on the Ash Center's YouTube page. So don't say anything that your parents don't want here. So today's seminar is part of a new series launched this semester on global challenges to democracy. It's co-organized by Professor Yunelda Gonzalez and myself. And one of the challenges of democracy, of course, is whether they can actually not just deliver representation and accountability, but also the harder things of clean air, clean water, and so on, an urgent priority in many developing societies. And this is sort of an area which I don't think has been studied as much as it should have. And today's talk is really going to touch on that theme. And we're delighted to welcome Tariq Thachil for our final seminar of this series this semester. And Tariq is the professor of political science and Madan Sobti chair for the Center of Contemporary India and director of the Center for the Advanced Study of India at the University of Pennsylvania. He's written very influentially on a whole host of issues, including political parties, political behavior, identity politics, urbanization, and migration, with a regional focus on India. His first book was won several awards, including the Gregory Lubbert Award for the Best Book in Comparative Politics and the Leon Epstein Award for Best Book on Political Parties. And it studied how elite parties use social services to win mass support through a study of Hindu nationalism in India. His second book has just come out from Princeton University Press and focuses on the political consequences of urbanization, drawing on qualitative and quantitative data collected across about 10 years of fieldwork in informal settlements in North India. Every single thing that Tariq writes wins a prize, and he's won also the Heinz.
Also themselves administered, but yeah.
Heinz Ulau Prize for the best article in the American Political Science Review, and he's published in many of the other top journals, including the American Journal of Political Science, Journal of Politics, and others. So with that, I'll hand the floor to Tariq. Thank you so much for coming, Tariq.
Thank you so much, Gautam. Thank you so much. And thank you so much to Gautam and Yunelda for having me. Yunelda and I realized that we met at a wedding and neither of us were aware at the time. And so that's always nice to meet someone in an out of academia context. And Gautam I've known since I'm now old enough to say since he was a pup. So it's nice to see him in this setting and to be here with all of you. As he said, so this is this is a very new area of work for both me and my fantastic co-author on the project, Shikhar Singh, who is a postdoc at the Center for Advanced Study of India at UPenn and is starting a position as assistant professor at Duke University in the fall. And for both Shikhar and me, this project is in a new area for us. We've both done a lot of work, I think, on kind of thinking about democratic accountability and some of the things that you're thinking about in the seminar series. But the area of air pollution and the issue of air pollution is still relatively new for us. And in part, that's because, as Gautam says, it's an area that hasn't really attracted quite as much attention from political scientists, and I'm happy to talk about why I think that might be the case. But for both Shikhar and me, I think this project is a first cut. So the paper that you're getting is kind of a brush clearing exercise for us. It's really the first step in an area, and we're very much thinking through what the most productive next steps would be. We have a couple in mind that I'll share at the end, but if there are other areas that you think we should really be focusing our attention, or components of what our findings that I present today that you think really merit further scrutiny, we'd love that, because we're kind of thinking of how to build this. But for us, the kind of immediate motivation for this project is that we're both residents of New Delhi, India, a city that's at the kind of epicenter of thinking about air pollution as a public health crisis. And just to give you a sense of this, this is a map of just one measure of air pollution, which is PM 2.5, which is basically measuring the prevalence of particulate matter that's less than 2.5 micrograms, basically enough to enter your bloodstream. So extremely fine particulate matter that's very dangerous for health consequences because it can enter into your skin and infect your bloodstream. So the red means worse, and you can see that there are major pockets, not just in in South Asia, but in the Middle East, across swaths of Central Africa, and in East Asia. But this part of the Indo-Gangetic Plain, not just India, but stretching into both Pakistan and Bangladesh as well, is one clear epicenter of the problem, the kind of global problem of air pollution as it stands now. If we look at PM1, so even smaller, and really in some ways the most deadly forms of particulate matter, then actually South Asia and this Indo-Gangetic Plain comes into even sharper focus. So really, I think it's not an overstatement to say it is the epicenter, not just India, but this South Asian Gangetic Plain, which is really one continuous airshed, is the biggest source of the problem, as at least from a public health perspective. And that's kind of backed up by the estimates of the kind of public health effects of air pollution. So overall, the WHO estimates somewhere between 6.5 and 9 million premature deaths due to air pollution annually. Over 90% of these deaths are in low and middle income countries. It's very difficult to kind of fully estimate the mortality effects, so the range is a bit high, but I would say the average Indian lifespan is shortened by between 3 and 6 years. Those are the conservative estimate is 3 years. Average Indian, not urban India, not Delhiite, but the average Indian lifespan is, the conservative is 3 years, the less conservative is 6 years. And India houses 39 of the world's 50 most polluted cities. I have this stat up there because it kind of motivates, but I actually over time have decided that this is not actually that great, because the truth is that this suggests that the problem is urban, and it's not. The problem is, we're studying it in a city, and it's important to think about it in the context of the city, but air pollution is a problem just as much in the kind of North Indian countryside as it is in cities. Still, 39 out of 50 is significant, and it gives you a sense of the scope of the problem. Just to give you a sense of what we're facing in Delhi, the city in which we're doing this study, the PM 2.5 concentration in Delhi was more than 10 times the WHO limit for 9 months of the calendar year in which we did this study, 2022. So just to give you a sense of kind of what we're doing in the study, this is the calendar year 2022 from January to December. The WHO limit is 5 for PM 2.5. That's what the limit is for kind of a safe PM 2.5 level. And this is the Delhi average across the year. So there is seasonality, which I'll show you a slide of in a second. And we actually deliberately timed the survey for a relatively average time. We didn't peak the most peak of the peak times. So I'm happy to talk about why we made that choice. But really, there is no time that's good for air pollution. So even these quote unquote low periods are still many times what the WHO limit is for. And this is PM 2.5. You use alternative measures like AQI, you're going to see a very similar story. And this is something that is, kind of in the kind of Indian news media cycle every winter. It's true in Pakistan as well at the same time. We kind of see some of these same headlines. So this is the Monument India Gate in central Delhi. On a relatively clear day. This is another shot on a highly polluted day. And you can see that part of what we want to say here is that this is a very visible problem, right? This is a problem that is immediately evident during these high periods. And we get these kind of episodic news cycles around this time, especially around the holiday of Diwali, where the confluence of a range of factors kind of combine to make air pollution especially high, saying, why is this happening? Why is this happening to us again? Why is Delhi a toxic gas chamber once more? Pollution is shortening lives by one study's estimate by almost a decade for the average Delhi resident. And other countries have solved this problem, not just countries in the West, but even a country like China has been able to clean up its air to a significant degree. A city like Beijing, why can't Delhi? And just to give you a sense of how recurring the problem is, this is a kind of a map, a different map of PM 2.5 over time, so 2018 to 2022, how it's kind of been mapped out over the course of the year. The main takeaway from this is that there's not really been very much movement on this. So it is a recurring problem. India has, and Delhi has not really significantly reduced its air pollution during this time. So the mean concentration that we have of 125 micrograms per cubic meter between 2007 and 2021 has barely nudged. It's declined by about 1.5 micrograms. At this rate of progress, it's going to take 80 years to reach WHO levels. And frankly, most residents of Delhi do not have 80 years for this problem to be solved. And in the past decade, a recent report said that it's basically now become the second largest risk factor to public health in all of India, behind only malnutrition. So other than malnutrition, it's now the second biggest cause of reduced lifespan. And yet, despite this, and this is where I think it kind of dovetails with the interest of this seminar, given that India is a competitive electoral setting, we see relative apathy among policymakers on this issue. So the Environment Ministry told Parliament in 2019 that there is no direct link between pollution and deaths or disease. This was their position. And in point of fact, you can kind of hold up that position because deaths are not the registered cause of death has never been air pollution. But the government itself, a government research body in that same year, in a Lancet study, estimated that 1 in 8 deaths in the country are linked to air quality. So why is the lead kind of policymakers on this figure trying to deny any link with and kind of deny this problem? The National Clean Air Program that's been rolled out for over 100 cities has basically no legal mandate, no penalties for non-compliance, no clear timelines for results. And in many ways, we've seen kind of what has been called fake policymaking, which is basically lackluster efforts by individual politicians when politicians are kind of pushed to do something about air pollution. And this is consistent with interviews we're currently conducting in the field. The thing that they want to do the most is often completely ineffective in fighting the problem. So the latest passion project of almost every Delhi politician we've talked to is smog towers, which are essentially like giant air filters that are marginally effective in the zone of the tower, but basically completely ineffective otherwise and very expensive. And so we can talk about why that is. This talk is not focusing so much on the policymakers, other than to say we're really not seeing policymakers very exercised about this problem, despite its severity. And one reason, and this is the motivation for this paper, is that frankly, voters themselves in Delhi and in India more broadly don't seem to be prioritizing air pollution as a problem. They don't seem to be kind of hankering for policymakers to act on this issue. So in the paper, we cite several different data sources where voters are asked, in open-ended questions, what's the most important political kind of issue for you when you vote? Air pollution, or indeed any issue of environmental degradation, is basically fewer than 2% of respondents, including in Delhi, representative samples of Delhi. We basically get between 2 and 4% of respondents saying that this is an issue, the most important issue for them across wave after wave of representative surveys. So we don't even have a critical minority of voters who are saying that this is something that is of utmost importance to them. Even outside of voting, we try to look to see if there's kind of public protest on this issue, which in India does occur. And in Delhi specifically, we have had protests on a range of different issues. So we analyzed with our colleagues, through our colleagues at Penn, and who've got a repository of about 8 million news reports from 8 different sources. And between 2012 and 2013, this is the kind of repository of the counts of news journals that they have and news sources that they have. And across those articles, we basically found pretty much no evidence of any kind of protest around the issue of air pollution, with one exception. It's so small you can't see the spike, but there's a single protest we were able to get across these different news sources that are both in English and in vernacular languages. And it also corresponded with our own qualitative checking, which was basically there was a single protest at India Gate, the monument I showed you. But even that protest, the reporting around it was the organizers disappointed that very few people showed up and the protest died within 2 days. So it was, again, a kind of a question of failure. So this led to the kind of question that actually a member of parliament has himself asked, which was, why are citizens not actively demanding clean air from their political representatives? And in some ways, this may be puzzling because unlike other forms of environmental degradation, and the climate change literature has actually noted this, air pollution has visible, immediate, and personal adverse impacts. This is not kind of sea level rise. This is not even the expansion of growing heat, which are often more difficult for people to discern. Of all the forms of environmental degradation, in many ways, air pollution is one of the most easy, visible, and personal and immediate in its impact. The second reason is that there are competitive elections that provide a channel for citizens to pressure politicians. And yet, in India, air pollution has been seen to not take the same central political priority, even as in China. So even in China, we've seen some evidence of public mobilization on this issue, even in a setting that's arguably harder to do so. And finally, air pollution regulation has been argued to be more effective in the presence of public engagement. So it actually matters to have an engaged public, even for a policy to be implemented and implemented well. And yet, at least we found, and we'd be eager for cites on this, very few studies. In fact, we could find really no systematic study about public opinion towards air pollution in a low-income democracy. There have been some studies in China, a couple of studies in Vietnam, but we really haven't found any effort to kind of map public opinion, which is why this paper takes the shape it does, because we really were trying to map for the first time in our understanding, what do people even think about this issue? And the reason we thought it was important to do so was a couple of things. One is that voter behavior might be able to incentivize democratic accountability in determining which political issues the politicians are going to prioritize when in government, but also their evaluation of politician performance might be important as a kind of accountability mechanism to get policymakers to act. And so we try and examine kind of things that fall into both buckets. And so essentially what we do in the paper is to look at several different candidate explanations for what's going on, what's kind of denuding the political action on this question. One set of arguments that we look at are drawn from kind of conventional expectations of voters in low and middle income countries. So these fall into a few different buckets. One is that they are ill-informed or lack awareness about the problem. So maybe and we even anecdotally heard this. I'll get to this in a second. The second is an issue of clarity of responsibility, that even if voters are aware of a problem, they may be confused about which tier of government to hold responsible, and so they don't coalesce to hold a particular tier accountable. They're kind of dispersed among these different tiers. The third very popular kind of explanation is the idea that voters are going to privilege development over the environment, and that especially with the low material base of voters in these settings, they are going to be especially likely to pick development over the environment and perceive a trade-off between these two things about material benefits and material development and toxic air. All of these had some resonance with field interviews that we did in Delhi. So we went around and talked to different groups of Delhi voters, trying to canvass their understanding of what they thought the problem here was, why it wasn't a political issue. And we got this kind of lack of information argument talked back to us. It wasn't just something that was kind of in the literature. Some Delhi residents said, people receive information about pollution, but because they're less educated, they don't understand it. They don't care about it. People are not informed. They don't understand this issue. They don't even know that the air that they're breathing is bad for them. So this is something that Delhi residents themselves were suggesting might be the problem. In terms of clarity of responsibility, this other bucket, we think of two different components. One, which we heard again and again in the context of Delhi, was a kind of fatalism. The idea that air pollution is not something you can do anything about. So, for example, as a small businessman told us, air pollution is not something that can be stopped. It's natural. No one can do anything about it. An engineer who told us, look, governments come and go. They can't make any difference. This is something that is beyond the purview of a policy maker. That's one particular bucket. The other might be actually confusion, as I said, about which tier to hold responsible. The third is this idea about this developmental priorities. And here we got, again, Delhi residents telling us, yes, it's true that the reason that it's not become a big issue is short-term material benefits are prioritized over the environment, that we will do pollution now because we think it's going to help our development. And the cost maybe will not be on us. It'll maybe be on future generations. It's about priorities. First, we need to focus on development. Then we can focus on things like pollution. Some of this rhetoric, by the way, is also parroted by policymakers. So a former environment minister said, this development climate trade-off or toxic air trade-off is actually in his discourse when he said that last month we saw clean rivers, green earth, blue sky, stars. This was during the pandemic where the lockdown basically cleared the air. And he said, if we want these things to continue, then we have to stop vehicles, industries. You can't even have cities. Basically, to develop is to have pollution. So those are the kind of three conventional explanations we were interested in looking at. We also wanted to add two that are less commonly examined among low-income settings, but we think might be important and have proven to be important in wealthier Western settings. One is partisanship. So is there some kind of partisan selective blame? I'll talk about that in a second. And the second is, are there fractures in the nature of public support for mitigation strategies? Are there kind of fracturing of those so people cannot agree on what they actually want done about the problem, and that attenuates their prioritizing the issue? I'll just talk about both of these for a second. With partisanship, so here, in some ways, India has not been a place where partisanship has been extensively studied. If anything, the kind of stylized fact has been that partisanship is weak in this setting. And secondly, environmental policies don't clearly map onto partisan divides. It's not clear that there's a party that has staked its claim on a kind of pro-environmental stance, including in Delhi. But what we did think about is in other settings, if there's selective blame, if you are only willing to blame poor performance on toxic air on your rival partisan group, and accordingly not blame your co-partisan or your co-party, the party that you favor, that will blunt your ability to hold elected officials accountable. Elected officials themselves will be muted in their response because they're going to know that their core supporters are going to be with them irrespective of their performance on this issue. And also, they're not going to win swing voters or voters of the rival partisan camp, even if they do well, because there's this selective kind of attribution of blame and credit.
That's the question.
Yeah, go for it.
So this should apply to all issues, right? So
we're agnostic about that. We want to know whether it applies to air pollution, whether it's a specific reason to, frankly, we haven't had studies about partisan blame in India on other issues. And that's actually something that we want to do going forward, because as we see in the paper, we find a lot of partisan selective blame. I wouldn't say going in, we were hearing from anybody, at least in kind of academic literature, that selective partisan blame was going to be the reason for kind of diminished incentives on air pollution for these top two reasons. But you're right. What we end up finding, there's no reason to expect it's specific. We can't rule out that we're not trying to make the claim that it's specific to air pollution. We're trying to see about whether air pollution gets blunted by this as a factor. Does that make sense? And there are some ex-ante reasons why we thought, there was a reason we put it in, which is that we thought that it may be possible, but there's some ex-ante reasons to not think that this would be the kind of number one candidate for what's going on. Does that make sense?
But yeah, so then do you think that what you measure in your surveys, if it's that direction you're going to go in, is just like a sort of expressive view of your, or rather sincere preference on?
No, so I think that it could, so in some ways we're again agnostic on that. What we want to know is when you're told specifically about an issue, and in this case that issue is air pollution, is your rating and evaluation of that issue in any way shaped by your partisan identity? If it is, I agree with you. The second step is to now see, is that specific to air pollution or something else? But even if it's not specific to air pollution, the fact that air pollution can come into a partisan vortex and blunt incentives when you're told specifically about performance information on air pollution, I think is significant. Does that make sense? Because either way, like we can it'll maybe be clear when I get into the empirics, but I think that even if it was an expressive preference, and we can't distinguish, I think, between whether it's the issue driving it or it's a general kind of partisan atmosphere, the fact that there is now a partisan atmosphere that can encapsulate air pollution, I think is a significant thing for us to pay attention to. That in some ways also brings it closer to the findings on the US settings and what's going on in the US. And in the US setting too, it's seen as a force that blunts accountability pressures on kind of environmental policies and environmental action. So it may be that there's something that's actually similarly happening in India, but just like in the US, partisanship on kind of evaluations of environmental policies is not divorced from a kind of larger expression of partisan identities. It can still have impact on incentives for environmental performance, right? Having very strong partisan attribution of blame can still have consequences for environmental performance. Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, I just to follow the thought a little bit further, maybe it's the case that when you have an area which you don't care all that much about, it's sort of cheaper to blame or to engage in this partisan blame misattribution. That's what you want to call it. Compared to issues in which like core economic interests might be at stake, for example. So that is that, I'm really going to care a lot. I'm going to hold a politician accountable on taxes, on my personal income and what it's risen and so on. But maybe environmental issues are different because people don't care. Maybe they should care, but they don't care about it.
Well, I think either way that's interesting. I think that
I agree with the interest.
Yeah. But I also think that I understand what you're saying. But I think that like that to me is not necessarily. I think it would be interesting to show that people have no partisan selective blame on tax. But first of all, the idea that they would think that this is a low priority enough issue, that proved to be the explanation now why we're seeing this partisan, that is issue specific. Your theory, the implication would be this should be very issue specific. We should see no partisan selective blame if we switch the issue to a different type of issue, right? Am I understanding that correctly?
Well, sort of. Why don't you continue? But I'll tell you why you might be able to actually, potentially push this forward a little bit.
Yeah, that'd be interesting. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say from like the American context also, like maybe this is the answer to Gautam's question. It's like the more traditional factors that you're saying are hindering accountability for air pollution here could actually lead to or enable this partisan selective attribution. So it's
kind of
hard to attribute blame in this federal structure in India that could enable partisanship. And so kind of like the,
Yeah, which is why I think it makes sense to see the findings in sequence.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, well, we're getting there, but like, we don't find any evidence of the conventional expectation. So it's not that voters are not informed. It's not that they're split among the different tiers.
Okay.
So it's not that they're actually like unable to pass out what's happening. It's not that they don't hold governments responsible in abstract for this issue. So I think it maybe makes sense to see it in context of the other findings. I think that the point though about whether it's issue specific, because unlike in the US, we don't study partisanship on any issue in India. So when it suddenly popped, we're like, well, we actually need to do these kinds of studies on lots of other issues as well. We don't have a bank of those studies, and so we don't have it on even the questions that Gautam is talking about. And so the kind of specific ways in which they measured in the US, like we have like a whole bunch of benchmarks that are available, which we don't have here. So I think that is a problem that has to be sorted out. Okay, so what I do think is that there is a world in which the selective attribution of blame should be something we pay attention to. This is kind of why we thought about it, which is that we're seeing parties try to use it as a deflection strategy. So we're seeing parties start to say that the problem is the other party. So in the case of Delhi, which is split between two parties, the state level is controlled by a party called AAP, Aam Aadmi Party, and the central government also has jurisdiction over the national capital, and that's headed by the BJP. The AAP's environment minister said that the pollution in the city was due to the lax attitude from neighboring states that were ruled by the BJP. It was not a problem that was caused by Delhi. It was caused by neighboring states. As a strong counterpoint, a national spokesperson for the BJP said that the ruler or the head of AAP, Arvind Kejriwal, has converted his city into a gas chamber, comparing him to Hitler. So this is a kind of extreme partisan rhetoric that's coming up. This is a billboard on air pollution. So parties are obviously interested in trying to bring partisan differences into this issue. And it is another reason that we thought it was worth kind of going into this in the paper. The second thing the final thing that we wanted to look at is sensitivity to costs of mitigation. So it may be that voters are kind of divided in different ways. First, there may be low support among the public for mitigation policies. There may be kind of cost sensitivities to those policies, or there may be fracturing across class and ethnic lines about which mitigation policy to pursue. So wealthy and poor Delhiites or members of different caste groups might have very different preferences over which policy to pursue. And that has implications for politicians and also for voters kind of coming together to demand accountability if they are very divided in what should be done about an issue. And we did see some evidence or some kind of talks in our interviews about people saying, people don't want to take the necessary steps. People may even see it's a problem, but they're not going to want to do anything about it. They're particularly not going to want to do things that inconvenience them. So everybody's told to take the Delhi metro, but nobody wants to do it if they don't have to. And until people are willing to take at least small steps that may inconvenience them, none of this is going to improve. So a possible bucket of things to look at. So I've gone through many different buckets, but those are the kind of 5 big buckets of things we were interested in exploring. And we do so through a large face-to-face survey that's kind of plausibly representative of Delhi's population. So to do so, we randomly selected 30 constituencies out of Delhi's 70 constituencies, electoral constituencies. And in each, we basically randomly selected 2 polling stations per constituency. And through publicly available voter lists, we basically interviewed 50 people at each polling station by selecting every kth person on the voter list, depending on how many people were on that given list. And basically, we were able to go to 60 polling stations. We were able to get about 42% of our originally selected respondent, which, whether it's high or low, is a little higher than what I thought, but we were able to get a decent number of people we originally selected. About half of our sample were women, about 85% were Hindu, and about 44% identified as supporters of the BJP, which roughly tracks with what census and other survey data lead us to expect. So, preview of the findings, I've already gone through this. Basically, we find no support for these conventional explanations, but we do find support for both the partisanship and public support for costly mitigation arguments. So how do we do this? On issue awareness and salience, we had 4 pre-registered tests. First, we asked, how serious is this problem in your city, in Delhi? And on average, air pollution scored 8.2. We tried to benchmark this against what has been understood to be a electorally salient issue in the city, which is garbage and sewage collection, which scored an 8. So it was pretty comparable and indistinguishable from a salient issue. We then asked whether people were aware about the impact of air pollution, the health impact. So we said, when there's a lot of pollution, do you have difficulty breathing? Do you have difficulty doing everyday things like going for a walk? We had pre-registered 0.5 as the level above which we would think this was a kind of recognized as high. And we got basically 0.77 and 0.66. So it's hard to, I think, argue that like the majority of Delhiites are not seeing that there's an impact on their lives from air pollution. These are two where we were just trying to look at broader information. So we asked people whether, compared to 10 years ago, Delhi summers are on average hotter, which they are, and 72% said that they were. And then we asked how serious is a problem like climate change, and we gave examples that were not necessarily linked to Delhi, so the melting of glaciers in the Himalayas and unseasonal rain. And again, it was 7 out of 10. And so I think overall, our kind of broader takeaway was trying to paint Delhi voters as unaware of this as a problem, and specifically air pollution as a problem, is not particularly convincing. We then asked about this willingness to blame politicians. Are people thinking that air pollution is something that a government should specifically do something about? So for fatalism, we asked, following other survey questions that have tried to ask this, is air pollution is unavoidable and no one can do anything to reduce it? How much do you agree with that statement? And again, pre-registered 5 as the level above which it would be considered high and support versus low. And basically, it's about 4. So people said about 4 out of 10 agreement with this. So it's not nothing, but I wouldn't say that this is like a hugely prevalent kind of emotion among the voters that we surveyed. Interestingly, we asked people who they blamed most for air pollution, and we pitted the government against actual leading emitters in the city. So that includes factory owners, people in construction, and vehicle owners. And what we found is that the government actually ties with vehicle owners as the leading single, they had to choose one who is the number one source of kind of responsibility for this problem. And I think what's also interesting is that Punjab farmers who burn their crops seasonally, and that's seen to be a huge source of air pollution in Delhi, and often are politically blamed conveniently by the Delhi government as the leading source of the problem. Voters actually don't seem to particularly buy that. So only 3% of them said Punjab farmers were the biggest source of the problem. Compare that with parliamentarians. 30% of all parliament questions on air pollution during this time were on the issue of stubble burning by farmers. So I actually came out of this thinking that voters are actually quite aware of where the problem is and isn't. And we can do some of the kind of compositional studies of air pollution, but they're not far off in identifying the leading sources of emitters and not the leading sources of emitters, and putting the government in the mix. We then asked whether they agreed on a scale from 1 to 10 that air pollution only happens because the government doesn't do anything to reduce it. So is the government to blame for the problem happening? And secondly, is it the government's responsibility to provide clean air to citizens? And in each case, we benchmarked against, again, things that voters have been understood to hold governments responsible for, particularly inflation, the issue of inflation and lower prices. And in both cases, air pollution rates lower than the very politically salient issue. But I would say it's not a substantively massive difference. So 7.36 say that that inflation only happens because the government does nothing to reduce it, versus 6.5, and 7.3 compared to 8.2. So they are different, but again, I would not say that these kind of show massive differences in terms of the substantive magnitude of responsibility. So we interpret this in the paper, at least, as evidence that it's not that voters see this as out of the government's purview. We then look at this issue of clarity of responsibility. I'm not going to go into each of these results, except to say that we take advantage of Delhi's jurisdictional status, where we actually vary the place that the voters are being asked about. Are they being asked about Delhi, the state itself, which is under split control at the national and state level, and 2 areas that neighbor Delhi, which are under unified party control by one party, the AAP, and by another party, the BJP. So we vary the partisan profile of who they're being asked. And no matter what the partisan profile, basically respondents always blame the same level of government, the state government. So there isn't this idea of dispersion of attribution or dispersion of who they should be holding responsible. There actually is some clarity in holding the state government responsible, not the national government, and not even both levels at the same time.
Can you explain this again, Tariq?
Sure. So I didn't want to get into too deep in the weeds because it gets a bit in the weeds of Indian politics, but basically Delhi is under split control between the AAP and the BJP. We said, who is most responsible for air pollution in Delhi? The state government, the national government, or both? 76% said the state government. We then went into a Delhi suburb, Ghaziabad and UP, which is ruled at both levels by the BJP. We said, here who is responsible? State, national, both. A comparable number said state. We then went to Punjab, which is ruled by the AAP government, the same as Delhi. And we said, okay, now we're fixing it as the AAP, the state is under the AAP. Who is responsible? The state government, the national government, or both? And again, people picked the state government. So irrespective of the partisan profile of the incumbent, or whether it's a split or unified control, basically across these different actual configurations of politics, the state government is seen as the one that is responsible. And again, for our purposes, whether that's correct or not is less important than is there coalescing. The idea that they're dispersed across these different levels doesn't seem to be coming through. The final kind of conventional bucket is this development versus environment question. Is it that voters perceive this trade-off? So first off, we'll say, we just asked, do you perceive a trade-off? So, when the government takes steps to reduce air pollution, will this reduce economic development, increase economic development, or have no impact? And the majority of people say it will reduce economic development. So they do perceive a trade-off compared to saying no impact or it'll actually increase development. So a trade-off is broadly perceived. But when we then asked, which is more important? So we tried to do it attitudinally first, which is just, which of the following statements do you agree with? Development will lead to air pollution, but development is more important, or the inverse, or both are important. A majority say that both controlling air pollution and development are important. And in fact, if you had to pick one or the other, fewer pick development than pick simply air pollution. So in other words, even though they perceive a trade-off, it's not that they all therefore say, if forced to pick, we would pick development over pollution. Typically, they would pick either saying both have to be prioritized, or if anything, pollution is prioritized. We then tried to ask it in terms of a policy preference. So we basically we said to voters, the government can either implement a policy where there's a subsidy of 10,000 rupees for first-time car buyers, basically a distributive policy that is going to pollute the air. 80% of our sample did not own cars, so most would have been eligible for this policy. The other policy is an equivalent rupee amount that's fined for cars, older cars that are past the emission standards, which would not be distributive. Most voters would not benefit under this policy, but it would be environmentally whatever. Most people picked the pollution fine, not the car subsidy, and that maintains even if we subset to the people who would actually be eligible who are non-car owners. Finally, we asked a kind of semi-behavioral measure where we gave people 2 stickers and asked which sticker would you prefer to put on your front door. Vote for a party only if they reduce pollution, or vote for a party only if they reduce the price of diesel petrol. I should say inadvertently during the course of the survey, the price of diesel petrol spiked, which we did not plan for. But despite that, 3/4 of respondents actually picked the pollution sticker to put on their front doors. So across these different measures, I don't think we got any kind of clear evidence that people are, even when they perceive a development trade-off, that they're uniquely lining behind kind of development trumping their environmental concerns. Okay, let me switch. Any questions on this before I go to the 2 new ones? Okay. So on the partisanship question that Gautam was talking about, here's how we did it. We basically did a survey experiment in which we showed respondents a picture of a power plant emitting smoke and randomly vary who scientists hold responsible for not removing that power plant from the city. For reference, Delhi has about 11 thermal power plants that are currently using coal and emitting smoke. And so the scientists in the experiment either blame the BJP government at the national level or the AAP government at the state level as responsible for this problem. We then split our sample based on a dimension of partisanship into BJP supporters and AAP supporters. And essentially, we then said, how much do you blame the government for this problem? How much do you see the government as responsible for this problem from between 0 and 10? And essentially what we found is BJP supporters are more likely to blame the AAP government. So they basically agree at 6.6 out of 10 when scientists blame the AAP. When the exact same thing, when scientists blame the BJP, that support reduces to 4.8. And the results with AAP are exactly inverted. So AAP supporters are more likely to blame the BJP government than their own AAP government. Now, just a thing on the magnitude of these effects. the difference in treatment effects across the two groups, which is typically what's seen as the kind of relevant quantity of interest in these partisan selective blame studies, is 3 out of 10. So basically 30% of the scale, which just as a point of reference is roughly 3 times the partisan difference for pandemic performance evaluations in the US that Shikhar found in a study with one of his co-authors using a similar technique. So this is quite a large effect. And I think this is something that we want to definitely explore more and welcome feedback. But this is essentially, kind of something that we kind of went into interested in, but I think these effects were larger than what we anticipated.
You explained the experimental setup.
Sure. The experimental setup was we showed.
So we'll give people a survey experiment, and then can you just continue?
Yeah, so we give people a survey experiment, and at the end of the survey experiment, we say, how much do you blame the government?
And the survey experiment, basically, you say the scientists blame the AAP government or the BJP government.
Only one or the other. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then
so if let's say, so this was administered randomly across the survey population, right? And then we have in the survey a measure of partisanship.
Yeah. Right. So you know who the AAP supporters are and who the BJP supporters are.
Correct. And that's who we're comparing here. Right. Okay. So when AAP supporters, but of course, AAP supporters are randomly sometimes shown that the BJP is to blame and randomly sometimes shown that AAP is to blame.
Correct.
Right. And so when AAP supporters are randomly shown that AAP is to blame, they say the government is 5.2 out of 10. I agree that the government is responsible for this problem, responsible for not cleaning the air. When AAP supporters are shown the same setup, but scientists instead are said to blame the BJP, then agreement with that statement goes up from 5.2 to 6.4.
The government, not the BJP government.
No, exactly. Just the government in question in the story. That's it. It's not
the state government.
No, it can be either it's whoever the scientists say. How much do you agree that the blank government is to blame? So if it's BJP, it would be BJP. If it's AAP, it's AAP.
Which government are they thinking of?
They're thinking of the one that the scientists have held responsible. They're just being asked to agree with the scientists' evaluation.
Does the scientists specify like a state government?
No, the scientists say they do. The scientists say that the BJP government led by Narendra Modi is responsible, and the AAP government led by Arvind Kejriwal is responsible. And then we just say, how much do you agree that the BJP government led by Modi, the same phrasing, is responsible, or the AAP government led by Arvind Kejriwal is responsible?
So they're thinking of the national government in one setting and the state government in the second setting.
Yes, but that's fixed. But yeah, absolutely. But the comparison is between when you're evaluating one party and the other, and when you're evaluating one party and the other. I don't think I'm understanding your question.
Well, so basically, when you randomize the partisan identity of the government in question, also randomizing whether it's the national government or the state government.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
So and when we read these graphs, so basically, suppose we just average across the full sample. What we should observe is that people have some baseline level of
agreement with the scientists' statement.
Yeah.
Because over the whole thing, it's 50% of the time it's the BJP who's being told is the problem, and 50% of the time that AAP is being said is the problem by scientists. Yeah. Scientists are not biased across the sample, right? It's 50-50 split.
So if people were sort of Bayesians, you would expect the whole distribution to move in the direction of blame, whichever one is actually to blame. Right?
Correct.
So let's suppose that everybody typically blames the state government for pollution, right? So the AAP government. And then they are told that the BJP government is being held responsible by the scientists. So they should shift on average in the direction of the national government being blamed.
Yeah, and vice versa as well, right? Like
and vice versa.
Yeah.
Got it. And so this graph.
So what this graph is showing is that when I'm told that the AAP government is responsible, so let's just focus on this side. Yeah. If I'm told that the AAP government is responsible for the problem, and then I'm asked, how much do you agree with the scientist evaluation?
Yeah.
If I'm a BJP supporter, I agree 6.6 times with the scientist evaluation.
All right.
The scientist evaluation of the same problem, when the BJP supporter is told that the BJP is responsible, it diminishes to 4.8. Right? So when they're told, does that make sense?
So they basically
they drop in their agreement with the scientist evaluation from when it's not their co-partisan party to when it is their co-partisan party. And the flip also happens with AAP supporters. When AAP supporters are told, hey, scientists say it's your party that's to blame. Do you agree? They say 5.2. When scientists say it's the other party to blame, they agree 6.4. Does that make sense?
Yes. But and so the inference you're making is about partisan blame,
Yes.
but this is just really a statement about people's beliefs about who's responsible.
No, so we do also do it within person. So if you're talking about the levels thing, we also do look because we've asked people who do you blame, the state government, the national government, etc.
Yeah.
And we do have something in the paper where we look at within person differences. Do you switch out of a convenient answer in terms of when we go through these different levels? And we actually do find that there's some selective switching. There's overall blaming of the state government, but there is some movement in the direction of selective switching when into a politically convenient answer, when you kind of move the setting from a place in which your party is in power to where your party is not in power at that level. So that's in the paper. I'm happy to talk about that. But if you're saying there's a structural feature here, I think that's what you're talking about, where the AAP is in power in one level and the central government and the BJP is in power in another, right? We can't randomize who is in power at what level.
But that's one part of it. But the other part of it is just that you're just eliciting my belief. I'm not learning anything really. I have a belief about whether the scientists are right or wrong.
Well, you're learning who scientists are holding responsible for this problem. I don't think you ex ante knew who scientists are holding responsible for the problem.
But I also have a prior, right? It's not a flat prior.
Mm-hmm.
And so in general, if I'm a BJP supporter,
Mm-hmm.
assuming that these are sincere preferences that are being elicited,
Mm-hmm.
I believe that the AAP government is more responsible.
Okay.
Right? Then the scientists say, actually, the BJP government is more responsible.
Right.
Right?
Or the AAP government is more responsible. You're getting both, right?
Yeah. Well,
you're getting both as a
getting
BJP
both.
supporter.
Right. But what I'm saying is, then you're just asking me my agreement with the statement, and I'm just more likely to disagree because I don't think that statement is true.
Right. I mean, I'm more likely to agree with the statement. But, I mean, I think we maybe take this offline, but because I'm not understanding. I mean, yes, but that is the point. That is how partisan selective blame is thought to work. I don't understand how that's any different with any partisan selective blame study. This is exactly how partisan blame is measured. And selective blame is measured.
Okay, well, let me.
The levels point I understand, but in terms of how this is done and who is being compared, that is how the kind of cross we're showing, that is how partisan selective blame is measured. So
yeah. I mean, I don't know about the partisan literature. I'm just trying to understand what is being done here and what people are understanding from the states.
What people are understanding is they're being told a kind of value statement by scientists about who scientists, ostensibly a neutral party, think is the source of the problem. Does their agreement with that potentially objectively neutral statement vary depending on who scientists are holding responsible in a partisan lens? And if you don't have any partisan selective blame, then whoever scientists hold responsible is the people that you agree with, right? More. So we should see that whatever the treatment effect is should basically be whoever the kind of scientists say is responsible, we should observe an equal effect with that. Where we don't see an equal effect is where the partisanship matches with your partisanship, right? So we see unequal effects depending on who is to blame. It's not about the fact that scientists are holding it, but scientific information is selectively believed depending on who it's attributing the blame to, right? That's, I think, what the goal of the exercise is. Okay, go for it.
Do you have any what level do the people who don't have any either partisan, like the independents or some other supporters of another political party, do you know is there any difference between which of the two they blame?
Yeah, so we actually bracket them from this, but we can look to just give, I think the overall thing of like how much a kind of neutral party blames on both, we can include that here. Here we were really, what we pre-registered was comparing the kind of AAP supporters and the BJP supporters, but
just because it does seem very much in line with like the studies in the US where like, how is the economy doing? And so if you're a Republican, evaluating Joe Biden's economy, you are going to underrate versus.
Agreed. I don't think this is any different. In fact, this is kind of identical to what a lot of studies in the US show on a number of different issues. But we are just applying that model to look in a setting where this typically isn't done, or at least I haven't seen a partisan selective blame study in Indian voting done, but specifically on this issue. So you're right. I don't think this is exactly what happens, not just on economy, etc., but even on a kind of health-related issue, in this case, pandemic evaluations, is exactly what was found in the US setting. The Singh and whatever study was done in the Singh and Graham study was done in the US.
I was wondering if in the question itself or in the vignette that people see about the scientist, does a scientist specifically say it's the BJP that is responsible for it, or do they just say the national government should do more?
No, they specify the party.
Okay.
They specify the party. Yeah. Yeah, that's the treatment. Is the saying the government led by. So it's the national government led by. So they include the government as well. So it doesn't seem like they're just naming the party, but the national government led by. Yeah. Okay. Final bucket was we looked at the support for mitigation policies. I'm not going to go through all of these policies, but basically we had a set of 8 policies that have been proposed at different times to reduce air pollution. So that includes a set of policies for kind of setting up more expenditure on renewable technology, 1 car limit for all households, the banning of bikes, the banning of diesel bikes, and the banning of diesel cars. And this is just showing overall support across the sample. And we asked respondents basically about a range of these different strategies. We found majority support for 6 of the 8 policies, including taxing rich households and using the money to reduce air pollution, generating more electricity from renewable sources, even if it's more expensive, which was put in the policy, and a 1 car limit for households. I think we had 83% agreement with the 1 car limit for households. We also looked at whether there were divergences in this support. So we looked at 2 around ethnic rank and affluence. So for ethnic rank, we kind of divided it into whether you were from a marginalized ethnic group, which in our case we said was if you were lower caste or a religious minority. And for affluence, we had a multidimensional measure, and this is basically looking at kind of higher affluence versus lower affluence split by the median measure. And essentially what we see here is a couple of things. One, there's only one policy area where there's significant differences between high and low rank ethnic groups. So overall, at least the distinction between high and low rank ethnic groups, we didn't see fracturing of policy differences. So this coefficient is telling us, basically the difference on that indicator variable, and we don't really find anything other than support for setting up polluting factories. We did find for affluence, we found 4 policy areas where their class differences do manifest, and there are differences between affluent and non-affluent voters, but in this, there are only 2 where the affluent preferences conflict with the majority opinion. So the affluent in our sample were actually in the direction. They were still agreeing with the majority opinion. There wasn't a division in the direction of the opinion itself. The one that there was substantively large differences, perhaps unsurprisingly, was taxes on the wealthy. But other than that, we don't see massive fracturing across these different policy dimensions. But what we do find is some sensitivity to personal costs of mitigation. So yes, the affluent are less supportive of a tax on the affluent. We also find respondents favor banning diesel cars over bikes, and cars are owned by only 20% of our sample. Bikes are owned by over 60% of our sample. And actually bikes now, I think, are about 40% of all vehicles on Delhi roads are 2-wheelers. And we find in some question wording experiments further support for basically the idea that there's extreme cost sensitivity or kind of shallowness to these preferences. So for example, when we ask people, do you support spending more on the environment? 89% say yes. But when we add just a simple prime that people like you will have to pay more taxes to finance this, that support drops to 47%. And at the same time, priming the costs of air pollution, so not just priming the cost of environmental action, but priming the costs of air pollution positively affects support for costly mitigation. So in this case, we actually said, we actually asked people, do you support the setting up of employment generating factories in the city? 87% said yes. We then added the prime that they will pollute the air, and that support dropped to 23%. So it's working both ways. It's not just the cost sensitivity working kind of against environmental policy, but if you prime the costs of pollution itself, it could potentially work the other way. And that informs the final component of the paper that I'll close on, which is randomized intervention we embedded in the survey to personalize the cost of air pollution. So basically, it was a pretty simple experiment in which we basically divided the sample into treatment and control, and the treatment group was given information using a portable handheld air quality monitor. And so these monitors basically provide we use them to provide an indoor reading of your household AQI, of the AQI inside your house. And we gave a very simple short script, which was just according to doctors and scientists, the AQI in your house should be under 50. Above 50 means the air is polluted and harmful to your health. According to research, breathing polluted air reduces your lifespan by about 5 years, basically in the middle of the range that we found on that studies have given. So in this case, if the AQI was shown to be 242, we'd say currently the air here is 192, more than 50. And this information was given at the start of the survey in the treatment group and at the end of the survey to the control group. And so essentially what we first looked at, our first outcome of interest, exactly reproduced the survey, that's the question that's been used on representative household surveys, which is an open-ended question on what is the election issue that's most important to you. So it's unprimed, it's just asking what is the most important issue. And 4% in the control group said air pollution, which roughly tracks with what these other surveys have found. That goes up to 19% in the treatment group. We also did the kind of that household sticker exercise. I reported earlier just the control group results, but that goes up to 81% in the treatment group. So a significant jump of 4.3 percentage points. However, we find no increase in the salience of the issue. So there's no kind of treatment effect on the salience of the issue or any impact on wanting to get further updates on air pollution via WhatsApp. So there's an indistinguishable effect on this. Would you like to receive updates on Delhi air pollution for the next 7 days on WhatsApp? So we find effects on the kind of more political prioritization variables, but nothing on kind of general issue salience or desiring more information. We do think that, and this was also backed up by some of the interviews that we did, we do think that people in general do not fully understand, and just anecdotally being there for some of these surveys, people were sometimes quite shocked by the reading inside their house, and would sometimes say things like, we knew that this happened in the park or outside, and we asked kids to not play out in the park when it's too late, during the winter months. And so we did see some kind of surprise about the level to which it's in the house, not the fact that it's a problem in general in the city. And so we think that that's something. I saw a hand up here. Sorry, Michelle, did you have a question?
Yeah, if you could go back to that. So this sticker exercise, how much should we take away from it, given that you said 80% of the people in your sample don't have cars? So like the cost of petrol does not matter to them.
No, the cost of petrol does actually affect, at least in the Indian context, it affects prices for a number of things, including food. So the cost of petrol is not just whether you consume petrol yourself, but the cost of petrol is indexed to a bunch of things. That's why it's a very salient issue.
And
it's not just
know that that's true.
Yeah. That's why people are really, because the moment petrol prices go up, the prices for everything goes up.
Okay.
So yeah, that's why it's a salient issue. If it was just for cars and for using it for that personal consumption, I don't think it would be that. I think you're right. It wouldn't be that significant.
Yeah, on the salience, I think, one reason why you might not see effects is just because
it's so high as a ceiling effect. Yeah, I agree. I think, again, going in, we didn't know even what the control group amount would be. So we weren't sure where we would find these. We were trying to measure different kinds of outcomes. I think you're 100% right, which is that, there's not very far to go here. I think it's also interesting that people didn't want to know more info, but I think one mistake we made was we just said on Delhi's air pollution. First, there are many protected, but like they already know that it's a problem in the city. I think the information that was relevant to them and resonant for them was the household AQI, which we couldn't offer to give them because we're not going to go back into their house every day for 7 days. But I think, something where they could actually check it for themselves potentially, and because what was most salient for them, at least that's our kind of reading of it, is that component. And they already know it's a problem. So for us to kind of bombard them with more messages that, the general city pollution is bad, I don't think is that relevant. Or at least that's how we interpret that.
One thing you might do also, if you're doing this again, but you could ask people, what are you willing to pay for this device?
Yeah, now this, again, I think this raises a bunch of questions. There are several, I'll get to a couple of, the limitations of this. I think this is a kind of interesting and was relatively kind of easy to embed in what was already a blush clearing survey. I think if we're just going to take this out and say there's some component of this that we want to play with, and what are the components that are most, there have been some studies that are trying to look at putting a household air purifier, running it and seeing what it is. But for us, the more relevant point out of this was not the action to clean the air, but actually the tailored information about the personal cost. The fact that it's actually a private problem, not just a public health problem, but a private health problem. And how we can kind of get to that messaging is the direction we've been thinking of. But yeah, we'd love thoughts on how to do that effectively. Oh, hand, yeah.
Just a brief question. That AQI thing is fascinating because it's right in their face. But do you think the folks understood like 50 versus 242? I mean, were they just numbers? Like, what would the park be? Did they know that?
So yeah, so I'd say that a couple of things. One, I think just the fact that it was much higher is probably what was registering. I don't think people were registering the granularity. When we look, I mean, that wasn't something we pre-registered, but we just looked at whether there's a lot of variation based on the difference. We didn't get huge variation in actual AQI across our sample, but there's some. So we looked at like just, do we see descriptively differences in the treatment effects based on what that difference was? And we actually don't. So I don't think it's as much that like you got 340 versus you got 180, but just the fact that you're being told that it's a significantly larger number. And almost always it was like close to like 60, 70, 80 points higher. And on average, 100 points higher than what it should be. So they're always getting dosed pretty strongly. But we didn't find that like there were a couple of like 350 readings that we got and a few readings that were above 200. We don't really see any effect in like your actual AQI score. So that's why I think probably not. So where are we going next to wrap up? I think, personalizing the costs of air pollution might increase political salience. We have seen other studies where increased risk salience has induced pro-environmental attitudes and political behaviors. So there's been some studies on wildlife exposure, some studies on experiences of floods. However, other studies have found that tailored information about environmental risks have actually reduced citizen concern. And of course, there are questions about how long-lasting these effects are. So I'm not, of course, this was a single-shot experiment and we're measuring the outcomes simultaneously. So there are, many questions about how robust these are. And in any case, I think there's a small literature on this, but already there's some disagreement about like how much this could matter. I think one point of note about this scholarship is it's exclusively on the global north. So there's little on focus on the global south, and almost none of it is on air pollution because air pollution is not the most significant environmental concern in the settings in which this is happening. So it's much more about rising sea levels, extreme heat. And so I think whatever it is, like trying to extend this a little bit and the insights of this scholarship a little bit into this issue domain might be a productive place to go. And more generally, I think we're trying to contribute to the understanding of environmental attitudes in lower middle income democracies, which I think overall remain very understudied. And already I think what we're finding pushes back against a kind of overly stylized and often untested assumptions about voters in these settings as having low information, squarely material motivations, weak partisan ties, and strong ethnic attachments. We actually don't find any of those necessarily kind of coming out in this study. Doesn't mean that they don't, like none of them have any salience, but I don't think we should just mechanically assume that that's what's going to happen in this setting. And I think in some ways, those views can contribute to an overstated perception of divisions in global public opinion on climate change. I mean, if anything, we find some striking similarities between residents of Delhi and Western democracies. We find at least that hyperpartisanship may be a shared challenge to accountability pressures and performance-based evaluations on this issue. And voters in both settings appear sensitive somewhat to personal costs of mitigation. And in the Indian context, maybe this means targeting policy actions that actually look at such sensitivities seriously. I mean, the Indian digital welfare state now can target quite effectively material benefits to individuals, thinking of a way to kind of make use of that to kind of offset some of the personal costs for mitigation is another potentially interesting area that policymakers in India have been interested in thinking through and hopefully taking up. And yeah, I think I'll stop there, but just say that I think the general call we're trying to make, whether or not the specific paper, is just not to only focus on technical fixes on air pollution. The literature has been dominated by kind of trying to scientifically understand the problem, which is important, looking at kind of potential policy solutions, but almost now no studies on political feasibility. So all policymakers we talk in India say we have a laundry list of things to be done, but most of them are not politically feasible, but then the buck kind of stops with that. So I think that's one place where we can kind of look for incentives of electoral politics and how to kind of bring them into the conversation. And next, what we're looking at is trying to study attitudes of elected representatives. What do they know about this issue? How do they think about taking action or inaction on this issue, their political incentives, as well as testing additional strategies for combating voter apathy. And on that, I welcome your feedback. So I'll stop there and thank you so much for your questions and look forward to any others that you have. Yeah.
Oh, do I?
No, do.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, well, my first question, which might relate to your next steps, has to do with elite capture or regulatory capture, for example, by industrialists, and sort of where a study of power might come in here. And it seems like there isn't much of a regulatory state with a legal mandate anyway, right? But is it an issue of regulatory capacity, legal mandate, or is it an issue of sort of politicians are just deferring to industrialists, so to speak?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think that it's a little bit of both. I mean, I think that there is a capacity question. So for example, one place the capacity question has come up is the few areas where we do have a regulatory structure in place in India. So one is on industrial emissions. So we think of kind of source apportionment studies. Industrial emissions are not actually necessarily always the biggest problem. The single biggest problem across all India is actually household burning of fuel. But in a place like Delhi, industry is a big emitter. There are regulations in place on industry, but they are very poorly enforced. Some of that is because of lack of staffing. Actually, state pollution control boards have lost staffing on average in the past decade, not gained them. But there are also political incentives, because the few studies that have tried to kind of look at how the audits are done by regulators find a lot of fudging of numbers, so that people are brought just below whatever the line might be for action, and often the implication is they're getting some kind of kickback. So there's a little bit of both, where there's kind of an economy of kickbacks, but there's also a kind of lack of capacity. But I think in many areas, the policy solutions may not require just enforcement and regulation. So for example, pushing electric vehicles, for example, would be one where you could think of maybe the political feasibility is higher. One area that has been identified as relatively low cost and potentially politically more feasible is to stop the burning of waste. But we don't see action even on those things, right? So it would be very hard to get construction bans or even stringent regulations on construction, because the building lobby is very politically powerful. But what's interesting about this issue is even relatively more politically feasible stuff where you don't see very powerful opposing interests, even there we don't see that much action. So I think it's kind of interesting. I mean, there are areas where you would say, like, I see why that's not happening, but other areas where you're like, I'm not sure why on this event nothing is happening.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah, Mashit, just go around.
This is great. This was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm trying to understand. So the question that you have is, why don't citizens hold them accountable? But could you talk me through what that would look like in this context?
Like, what would accountability look
what
like?
would that look like? So how would people change their behavior to hold someone accountable? And I'm also trying to figure out what the real world analog is of the experiment that you do on partisanship. So scientists say it's the BJP's fault, but whose fault is it? Who should people be holding accountable?
Yeah, so I think that depends again on I can go in order. So, how would citizens hold like their representatives accountable on this issue? I mean, I think one of the things that we often get told when we present this in India is that, look, it's such a confusing issue, right? And that's true, like, how are people supposed to know what the right source or the person to hold responsible for this issue is? And that point I take completely. The only thing I would say is that that's true of many, many issues. So even inflation, the average citizen in India does not know how inflation, forget the average citizen, I mean, the top 10% of educated people may not understand actually how inflation works, what monetary policy is and is required, who is responsible. And actually, they do not directly elect the people who are responsible for monetary policy in many senses. So yet, that has not stopped them from making demands and protesting against price rise. We very often see protests on that issue. And so I think the levers that democratic accountability provide is to make noise on often your elected representative. And at least in other work, what we found is that it's often the elected representative who is the port of call. And so I think what we would expect to see is some holding of elected representatives accountable. That could be in everyday complaints. It doesn't just have to be in elections where we focus on the vote here, but it could be, that's why we even looked at protests. I mean, we're open to kind of other measures that we could actually capture of holding people accountable. But like one thing we're doing is actually asking local reps, do people come to you complaining about this issue? And really, they don't. I mean, they complain to each other, and people will complain. If you start a focus group, there's no shortage of people wanting to complain about the issue. But many other things that they complain about, they've also at least tried to go to their elected rep to say, what are we doing about this, right? Even if they don't fully understand the policy-making apparatus. So I think I totally take your point. But I think that we do see public action on a range of things that citizens may lack the full understanding of the policy consequence for. And in some ways, I guess I'm personally been reluctant to go down that because it becomes a very convenient, that's not your question, but the spirit in which it's told to us in Delhi is almost a way to kind of kill this on impact. It's too complicated. We kind of throw hands up on the air. Let's focus on things that are more kind of tactically feasible. But I think that the system has allowed for people to voice concerns on pretty complex issues and even get some modicum of, the price of onions, for example, in Delhi has been the point of people don't fully understand how onion prices are set, but they've been able to pressure on that. Yeah, actually, good.
Great, thank you. This is super interesting and definitely challenged a lot of my trials. I have two follow-up questions. One, perhaps you'll get to this in your forthcoming work as well, which is, I was wondering why there's not more electoral competition around this. So it seems like voters, from your survey, it seems like voters do seem to care a good deal about this issue. Parties could do a better job of holding each other accountable. And so is it the case that they don't know that voters care about this? Or sort of why is it that, parties aren't doing a better job of basically assigning blame to each other on this issue?
Yeah.
And then the second question is in terms of what citizens can do. I'm also curious about the horizontal accountability aspect of this. So for instance, citizens recognize that there are ways through either the courts or through some of these pollution control boards where they might be able to exercise some influence besides just, voting for a politician or not?
Yeah.
I mean, these are both sort of tangential to what you just presented, but those were questions. Yeah.
No, I also realized I didn't answer Michelle's second question, which is who is actually to blame. I think that is where things are complicated because it depends a little bit on what the source of the emissions are. So there are several big sources of emissions in Delhi and in any part of India. But in Delhi, for example, the sources are vehicular emissions, which would mostly come under the state government. Industrial emissions, which would come under the state government for industries that are located within the Delhi state. But for other state governments, and there's a mixture of both that are present in Delhi. Construction, which is mostly for within the state government. But then things that are happening just outside, which the national government would have to regulate, and some of the overall regulatory standards the national government has to set. So there is a mix of apportionment of blame depending on what it is. But it's also true that there's no government that doesn't have something that they can do. So I think that even local government, for example, municipal waste falls under local government. So even the most local government, there are things that they could do to address this issue. Nobody can address 100%. But and in fact, in Delhi, about 50% of the emissions come from within Delhi, and about 50% come from without. So it really means that there's 50% that requires interjurisdictional coordination under the central government, and 50% that comes under the state and local government. So there are sources to attack for everyone. But you're right that there's this is why the scientists are only attributing blame for one source, not for Delhi's air pollution in this case, but even in general, I don't think you could say one party is to blame for air pollution. Sorry, did you have a follow-up on that?
Yeah, so a follow-up on that, is pollution a special thing in that way? So is it just that responsibility is so diffuse that you could actually just blame so many actors and then it's harder for anger to be directed towards one?
I think that the interjurisdictional issues in air pollution are significant and one issue that marks it. I don't think it's alone in that. A lot of environmental issues fall under that bucket. So cleaning of rivers, which is a huge, water pollution also falls under that bucket, and where it should happen and who, the downstream versus upstream issues that come with that. But I don't think it's the only issue on which interjurisdictional blame can be apportioned. In India, even economic stuff that, can get blamed on, well, the actual problem is a supply chain issue that comes somewhere else, or we actually blame truckers from a different state for not getting things over. So there are ways, if you really want to, you can find ways to blame things that are outside of your jurisdiction no matter what. But you're right that in truth, air pollution, 50% of the problem would require a tremendous amount of coordination. And that may not be true for every issue. So I think that is true, but I don't think it's unique among environmental issues for that problem. Sorry, to your question, sorry, I just didn't want to skip that. This is a big puzzle for us, especially on opposition. So we've been trying to figure out, like, if you're in the opposition, but in Delhi, that may be a bad place to test it because both major players are in the opposition at one level. So, we'd be interested in a place like Ghaziabad or in Uttar Pradesh, in the neighboring state, where there's unified control under the BJP. Can you go hammer and tongs after the party? And why is the opposition not doing that? One of the things we hope to test by surveying the policymakers are, do they underestimate how much citizens know or care about this? It's also true that citizens aren't giving them a lot of indicators that this is something they should put on the menu or something that they would really rally behind them. That if I'm going to put a rally behind air pollution, that hundreds are going to come in the street. And so I think that may be why. And it may be, again, this point of people have very defined preferences, but they're shallow. So, and this gets to the willingness to pay point in different ways, that I may systematically kind of rate something very high, but it very quickly dissipates for me. And some of the stuff on the kind of costly mitigation, I think, speaks to that. So that may be another source of kind of politicians feeling that they can't. Maybe they've done little trial balloons and we don't know. They're trying this and we just don't see it. In terms of what citizens can do, courts have been the main place that citizens have gone to, but it's really been well-heeled citizens. And one of the consequences of that has been the fight against air pollution in India has largely been legal actions that are very blunt, like bans. And that may not even be the best way to fight the problem, because the costs of that could be in there. The development trade-offs might be more extreme. There's no kind of graded kind of policy on something. So something that might be taxes or graded fines, kind of intermediate approaches have largely been kind of neglected. And it's really been a kind of well-heeled group of citizens going to the court, getting a particular ban. And most of those have been kind of blunt, often episodic, and often kind of reactive band-aids. The pollution spikes to a very high level and the courts come down and say something. And that's often informed policy-making response. So the Delhi action plans on pollution are mostly like, when pollution hits this level, shut schools down. Right? But that's not a solution to the problem. Or when pollution hits such a level, then you induce artificial rain, which is the newest policy darling, and also completely ineffective. So, but that it's also kind of created this kind of very reactive, blunt response policies rather than kind of long-term and kind of more graded policies. So I think that's been one of the implications of this approach. I saw another hand there, and then yeah, go ahead.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the viewpoint that citizens are much more sophisticated and politically savvy. I think that reflects a lot of my experience on the ground more than a lot of characterizations are common in media. I'm from Thailand and from a city that you might have heard, a lot of Thai cities really compete with India in 500-600 AQI, 2.5 and really deadly levels. The difference in context, I imagine, is that in Thailand, people are actually, politicians really do engage on these issues more. But the difference is that rather than being Ghaziabad and Delhi and Haryana all being in the same unit, a lot of the pollution sources were neighboring countries. So it's Laos, Myanmar, where even if there is this blame and there seems to be political parties that coalesce around the issue, it doesn't seem to gain a lot of traction and solvability because of that. Do you think? And I imagine this is common in in the picture that you painted out of the map, maybe in a lot of Central African belt. A lot of these are cross-border issues. Do you feel this analysis around the way that making the issue an individual cause for people, assigning more clear avenues of accountability also work in this international, not just interjurisdictional situation?
It's an interesting question. First of all, it's fascinating too, and I'd love to know how the issue got politicized in Thailand. I mean, one thing that comes to mind is if politicians know that at the end of the day, they can't really be held for the solution, it may be something that's easy or profitable to make a lot of noise and sound very angry about and sound kind of enraged about. But at the end of the day, it's not really something. I'm curious how they differentiate between themselves then, if everybody is just this is a big problem, but we blame Laos. How you can kind of net benefit from that relative to kind of an opposition party. But one of the problems I think in India, India definitely, this is a cross-border issue, both with Pakistan and with Bangladesh, meaning it's an issue in which some pollution that comes from India definitely goes into Pakistan and vice versa, and also with Bangladesh. I think the issue is that large swaths of central India cannot hide under that problem.
And so I think it would be interesting to see if there's different opportunities for political parties that are competing in those kinds of jurisdictions to think about this question differently. But in the area, at least that we've been studying it, they know, I mean, this idea of being able to blame another country, which I think is a different, does different things to incentives and accountability pressures than one that's interjurisdictional, where you might and sometimes do come into power. Right, and have some claim and might have the target on your back. And one thing that we got told that really blunted the incentives on the policymaker side was the fear that they were the ones who are going to pay make people pay the cost, incur all of the anger, and then the benefits would be something that people would not be able to measure or would happen or even accrue to the next party or the next incumbent. And so that is a logic that's very kind of national in its scope. So I'm not sure that it would, I think the logic for the kind of, it's very interesting, but I think the logic would be kind of fundamentally different in some ways. The arenas of contestation would also be different. But that's really interesting. Thanks for that.
First, thank you so much for this. This is absolutely fascinating. And I think that, I think as Cam highlighted, I think there are really important contributions here already in dispelling some of the common explanations for why we don't see much action. Like people do understand of the issue and they understand that it's serious and they care about it. But I wanted to ask some questions about even like the attribution and the extent to which that really even matters. So for example, I'm thinking about this in relationship to my work on policing and sort of people's understanding or not of who is responsible for crime and security in their communities, right? So I have a paper co-authored with Shikhar Singh, and we look at 3 different countries. We look at like Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico, and we find a similar pattern where like mayors are tripping over themselves to get involved in policing and security, where they don't have police forces, but they are like falling over themselves to like get involved, left wing, right wing, sort of all across the board, and that is because of that bottom up demand. And so I think that is really where I think more traction is needed, or sort of we need more answers, because I feel like we still don't have an answer to your question about why don't citizens hold politicians accountable for air pollution, given that they do know about it, given that they do seem to have at least to some degree a real understanding of who is responsible, right? So it's the opposite of the attribution issue that we have, which is that like again, as a mayor of Sao Paulo, of Bogota or whatever, you literally could just go, hey, this is the governor's problem, this is not my issue. But instead they're saying like, no, we need to get more involved in security because we need to make you safer. And that's because they see how much citizen mobilization is happening around us. I mean, this is an issue that does bring many people out into the streets to protest. This is an issue that poll after poll, even in very safe communities, safe cities, like 60% of people will say this is the #1 problem. And so it seems that attribution is less of an issue or knowledge than simply, why aren't people, a different question, why aren't people mobilizing around an issue that they recognize is important, that they recognize has implications, that they do have a pretty clear sense of who is responsible. And so I wonder how much traction do we have on that, sort of on that question, because the sort of real life experience, because then I think you would see like, I think the answer is clear. Why don't you see kind of an entrepreneurial politician saying, hey, we're going to own this issue in the way that, 15 years ago we saw around crime in Latin America, but now everybody, left, right, ideology is not a thing that's going to differentiate you on crime these days, right? And so I think the question is clear about why wouldn't any politician touch this, because there's no real payoff in terms of like.
Yeah, and I think no, I take your point, and I think that, what I would say is that I agree with you. I think that the first layer to the answer is to start with like where we think it's not. And to say that, I mean, I heard repeatedly that people, like especially lower income voters, would just not be aware of how much a problem this is. And I heard this both within Delhi and among political scientists, where it was like when I was first kind of workshopping this question. And the second was the development versus environment. In fact, I got that most from global north scholars, saying that this is going to be the thing. This is going to be the thing that falls. And I'm not saying that it's not like, I don't think this is the one test, but I think just even pushing back against that and saying, let's not just assume that that's the case, is the beginning. But the second thing is to say that I think there are little glimmers of where the problem might be. So again, we can talk about the selective attribution point, but the idea that if it's susceptible to that, whether there's a growing partisan polarization in the Indian context and this is being subsumed under it, or whether it's issue specific, which we can't tell in the earlier conversation with Gautam, either way, it suggests that one reason might be that the moment you start trying to mobilize on this, you're going to get into a partisan hopper. And we're already seeing little signs of that, right? If you bring up air pollution and the other party says you're like Hitler, creating a gas chamber, and then the reverse, and then that becomes the modal strategy for how a policymaker is going to respond to this, is to engage in extreme partisan displacement as the strategy, not I'm going to take this on, and know that my supporters are going to be with me no matter what, and I'm not going to get people on the other side no matter what. That's I think the logic. I'm not, and this is not a comprehensive, but to suggest that is that part of what's creating the lack of incentive to really get a political entrepreneur to mobilize on that. And I think the second point is like actually a deeper understanding of preferences. This is a very first cut, but like this idea is like, is it shallow? Is there low willingness to pay? Is there a misunderstanding of the personal costs of this? How do we explore that? Is it the type of information? What we need to understand? Not just air pollution is bad, but what about it is bad? Different kinds of messaging that get through. Now, you're right. The idea that any of that is going to suddenly lead people to the streets is very unlikely. And so we're dealing in the world of kind of incremental kind of outcome measurement. But I think that at least even getting some traction on that is where we see it. Like just at least opening the doors for what that is where to see it, rather than not kind of look at it and kind of assume that the solution is going to be top-down technocratic, which is largely what we hear in India, that if it's going to come, it has to come from some kind of top-down technocrat, but it hasn't happened. I mean, this has been a problem for 20 years. It's not a problem that's just come up in the last 5 years.
Is there anything, because even on the issue of policing, this is like police violence, the thing that happens every single day, right, in the United States, but it's when you have sort of a high-profile scandal or something, and that's when you see people getting to the streets. Are you able to identify sort of any scandals where like, something really, really glaring happened or something that received a lot of attention that then tells you like people are willing to mobilize?
I mean, it does, you mean but linked to pollution? I mean, there's an annual cycle that lends itself, there's a news media cycle that comes annually. So when the AQI hits, 400, 500, 600, newspaper stories start carrying it. It's where we get our annual request to write an op-ed on this, and we're like, not yet, because we're going to get the partisan chamber as well. But it's like, there's a news cycle around it, but it's not linked to a particular scandal, or it's not linked to a particular like event that makes it easy to politicize. We found one set of politicians, a group of 3, who tried during one day that it was like a very high AQI to put on like masks, like some kind of oxygen mask, and do a little protest, but nobody showed. And so again, this goes back to like, why is that not happening, etc. But like, I think it goes back to the same problem, but we haven't seen like a natural place for this too. But there are many opportunities. I mean, the days that it's 600, there are many kinds of visible things you can do to kind of make hay of this and kind of have pageantry around it, but not really, not so far.
So can I just ask a final question?
Yeah, of course.
So are you saying that people think that this is a serious issue, or they don't think it's a serious issue? Like when you say that preferences are shallow.
No, I'm saying sorry, go ahead, yeah.
And they understand the health costs and so on. But yet, only 2% of people say that it's the most significant issue facing them. Mm-hmm. Is the point that people think that this is really important and, essential, or it's not actually that essential?
Well, I think that so part of it is, I think it's a little bit more nuanced. So I think that they obviously think that it is an important issue in aggregate, like when it's phrased as like, is air pollution a problem?
Yeah.
Is it something that impacts you? But I think the kind of severity of its health impact, I don't think is necessarily as well understood. So saying it like I have some difficulty breathing when I go out during high pollution days is not the same as saying I understand its impact on the reduced lifespan of me and my children, right? Like, so I think that there is, so the kind of information that we're giving in the AQI, or the fact that this is coming into your house, which is another thing of the scope of the problem. Mm-hmm. So I think that people may both simultaneously understand that this is a big problem and still underestimate how severe of an all-pervasive a health problem it might be. That is how I'm kind of understanding the picture of this. But the second part of your question, which is like the shallowness of preferences, all I can say is like looking across the results, the fact that people in general have pro-environmental attitudes, mm-hmm. but again, when you give a kind of, there's a little bit of NIMBYism in those attitudes, right? In terms of like when the mitigation policy is affecting me, my support for it is a little bit lower. And when I'm primed with a cost, it kind of quickly goes away. My thought on that is if we were to really focus on that, and the next round of surveys actually had like a specific focus on that, and we tested it in different ways. One possibility that we might find is the direction is always in this. I think this is a problem. But the moment I have to actually incur some kind of inconvenience to solve it, then that's the issue, right? So it's not that like, I don't understand that it's a problem, but I don't want to have to be personally inconvenienced to solve that problem. And that is a slightly different kind of shallowness of preferences than shallowness of my understanding of the issue. Does that make sense? So I think those are the two levels in which I'm thinking about it. But yeah, I mean, again, the other big question is like, this is specific to Delhi. Delhi is a specific kind of environment where it's been, at least in the news media, it's kind of highlighted. So I don't know if we went into, say, small towns of India where air pollution is just as bad, maybe their information is lower. Maybe people do not have an understanding, even of the level 1, impact on their breathing and stuff like that Delhiites do. So it could be that this is specific to this setting. We started in Delhi because we thought it's the most likely setting for people to care, for it to become an election issue, for it to somehow enter into the discourse, and it's not happening. But that also may mean that it has, this may not apply to other settings with other kinds of electoral constituencies. So I think that's another thing to kind of see. It's not that we're saying this is the explanation for India. But it was the place that we thought was most fruitful to kind of examine first. So, yeah.
Well, this is a really exciting project.
Thank you so much.
Learned a great deal. I think we all